Hi, and welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, speaker, and general explorer when it comes to customer and employee experience. I'm really interested in figuring out what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees. So with that in mind, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, authors and academics to uncover some clues about what it takes to build such an organization. Now, some of you may know the podcast as the Rare Business Podcast, but I decided to rename and rebrand the podcast recently. This is for a number of reasons. First one was to mirror the title of my book Punk CX, which was published in June 2019. Two, because I'm a fan of punk music. And three, it's just more fun, right? If this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then hello and welcome. Please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsko.com, as I've now completed over 300 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then welcome back and thank you. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have my friend, Richie Manu, who is also a multi-award winning university lecturer, a creative consultant and an author, and now, ladies and gentlemen, program director of culture and enterprise at UAL, which is the University of the Arts in London, which also covers Central St. Martin's College. Hey Richie, how you doing? And first of all, congratulations on the new role, but how are you doing?
I'm really well, really well. Thank you for inviting me to this podcast series, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to our discussion today.
Fantastic. So, Richie, for the benefit of people that don't know you as I do, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and also about the work that you do?
Yeah, I will. So I'm Richie Manu. I'm a university lecturer, an academic, a teaching scholar, and I help run a course at the moment called MA Applied Imagination, which is a course that looks at how we can use creativity to affect change. So I've been working with course leaders on that course for the last 4 or 5 years, and I'm now part of the Culture and Enterprise program. As a program director, I'll be working with the other courses within that program to look at ways that our courses can be a lot more future forward looking, to not just address problems, but to also anticipate the future, to see what creativity really looks like.
Nice.
I've had probably about 25 years of branding experience. So I started out as a brand consultant. I worked primarily with startups. My passion was working with brands that didn't really have any direction, but I could grow with them. So I was really in my element, working with organizations that wanted to develop an identity, but then see how that emerged as a brand. And much of the time, those brands were never aesthetic. It was really about developing a culture of the organization. So I've worked with corporates, to housing associations, to record companies, to artists, music artists. So there was a broad range. I never wanted to be boxed in one area, but to really apply my kind of methodology of what design branding is. And I was able to take that into, I didn't necessarily want to theorize it, but after years of doing this, I felt that I wanted to kind of encapsulate this in some kind of written form. So I for my sins, wrote a book called You Rebranded, which looked at how I have developed strategies and methodologies and processes that help individuals and brands differentiate. And that there are a lot of things that went through rigorous research and processes and things that were tried and tested. And it felt good to be able to say, right, this is what I've been practicing for many years, and this is what it looks like. And it was really well received. New brands started to take that on as things that they could start to use as part of their own growth process and strategy.
Nice. Now, as I said, we've known each other for a while, and I wanted to invite you on the podcast to get your perspective on this like whole experience thing, right? But particularly from a creative design brand led perspective, and and particularly to focus on some of the challenges and changes that we're seeing happening in front of us. But before we get into that, I mean, over the last few months, we've seen some massive kind of changes kind of going on, and we're kind of in the throes of a global pandemic. So from your perspective, I mean, first of all, how have the last few months been for you, and what's kind of changed, and what has stood out from you? What are the big lessons and takeaways?
So often I respond to that in two ways. I think depending on who you speak to, this period of time that we're in has a very different timeline. So people will probably locate and refer to this moment from the moment we had lockdown. So for many people, this experience started on March 3rd, 24th. For me, the emergence of COVID, for example, started right at the beginning of around late January, February, and because of my role in teaching, I've got a predominantly a student body that were predominantly from East Asia, and so there were many that were coming in from China, from South Korea, from Taiwan, Hong Kong, so lots of places around about, including the US and Bahrain and the Middle East. So I had a really international audience in a live space. So I was doing lectures and teaching, and then there was this emergence of something that was happening in Wuhan in China. So we started to get kind of news of this emergence of a virus, and so for me, it was really about managing a space where we had to consider the mindset, the well-being of students in that space. So for me, at the beginning of all this, I was thinking about how agile my teaching and my profession had to be, and not having to rely on a physical presence, but how you might embody online teaching. So maybe a short answer to your question is, I think it's been, I've taken nothing for granted. I've had to learn along the way, not necessarily having to take anything online for granted, and to ensure that this space of teaching online and learning and figuring out what this online space is, how I had to adapt to that new space, but also really put into right at the forefront the students' perspective, what they were getting from it, but also, and this is not just about education, this is about how we all had to adapt as a society. People who didn't even know what Zoom was right at the beginning of all of this. So I think, from my perspective, I've had to adapt and do a lot of learning. I think society, if I had to kind of pull the lens back, I think it's incredible how society has been able to adapt and move for good and bad. I mean, right at the top of this, we have individuals who have had to have Zoom meetings, and unfortunately, people have had to resort to online funerals, for example, which is, and how we've had to adapt to restrictions, and I mean, it's heartbreaking. But at the same time, we've also seen the resilience. I know it's one of the factors you talk about, and we will talk about that later on. One of the things you wrote about in one of your recent articles. But I think how resilient we've had to be as a society, as a community, but also as a global community, if that exists. I've got my own views on my kind of take on how, as a global community, we could be more receptive and more kind of congruent about, kind of more collegiate, around our response to COVID, for example. I just think there could have been much more joined up effort. Maybe that's another podcast.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe. But I mean, my next question was going to be, because I'm really interested in, as you know, about experience, whether that is customer or employee or whichever kind of lens you want to put on the front of it. And I know that with this massive move to remote or controlled situations, that I was just thinking about how you had to redesign both the the student and the teacher experience. But it seems to me that you've actually been doing that kind of on the fly, but with intention. And I mean, and you emphasize the kind of the learning kind of part of it. I mean, that must have been, I mean, it must have been a challenge, because he must have,
Yeah.
I mean, and he can't have got it all kind of right. I mean, I guess, but how do you bring your students and your colleagues with you in that respect?
Well, I think one of the first things, Adrian, that I recognize is that you can't replicate the physical space online. I think that's one of the biggest assumptions, and probably one of the biggest mistakes any of us could do, whether you're in education or whether you're in entertainment or whether you're in business in general. I think one of the first things we recognize is that, for example, a 45-minute lecture or an hour lecture is not the same as delivering online. And you've got to bring a totally new ideology, methodology to that space. You have to respect the online space. So the first thing we did was to agree that, for example, lectures had to take on a very, very different shape, and that you might chop and change it so that there's a portion of knowledge transfer. You might then break people up into groups and just check in on people to ensure that you have that engagement. Maybe you might go to third-party software to get people to input material. You might involve video, invite people to come and talk into the mic. So there's a much more inclusive environment. But to try and keep that going for an hour or two is not productive. So the first thing we had to do was look at what that timeline really looked like.
Right.
And if we think about, I can't remember the study, but I was involved with the BBC Worldwide Service a couple of years back. But they'd done a study on, I think it was 16 to 25-year-olds, and they created a series of minute podcasts, so 60-second broadcasts for a younger generation. And they asked me to contribute to a series of really small sound bites, for example, how you differentiate yourself, networking, and several other factors. What I learned from that is how young people digest material and digest information, and it's fast and it's furious and it's just literally getting all this information out. And that's the first thing we had to learn, is that we have to switch a different mode of education so that you are respecting that digital space and understand that there are different modes of learning as well.
Yeah.
So the first thing we had to do is make sure that if you are showing any video, perhaps you're showing an extract, you can't expect people to sit down and watch a 20-minute TED talk, for example, during a lecture. It's just not productive. So perhaps you might show an extract and then provide a link and then get them to do that in their own time, but take out the key elements. And this is for a couple of reasons. Number one, you have to ensure that you keep them engaged. But number two, pull out the best bits so that you leave room for discussion. So we might say, right, let's look at this for 1 minute, or 1 or 2 minutes, and then bring the audience in. So I think, maybe just to sum up, I think what I saw online was a greater need for inclusive, interactive spaces where students and also practitioners and academics like myself could contribute to that space.
Yeah, I mean, that completely mirrors my own experience, where I've had a project going on where it's with an organization, and we would normally do some stuff face to face, and then we thought about chunking it down, and it would normally be face to face with like a group of people that was possibly about 25 kind of like strong, and we would normally do it sort of over the course of a day with 25 people, lots of interactivity, lots of activity, all that type of stuff. And we thought, well, actually we can't really do that in a virtual sort of space. I know some people have tried and not done very well. So we thought about how do we chunk it down. So we had ended up getting to the point where we could chunked it down into run 3 separate groups for 2 hours, as it were, and try and keep the pace and the interactivity kind of going. So we'd start with, here's what we want to do. Now let's start with an activity to get people kind of juices growing, use kind of like, as you say, that third-party software. We were using kind of Jamboard to get people to, Google's Jamboard, to get people to come up with, say, brand names that responded to, that they identified with in response to a certain question, and then we would talk through that, and then we'd share some content, and then related to that, we'd have like 3 examples that I would say run them through that one example, and then ask them to get to respond to that. So, what do you like? What do you not like? And so on and so forth. And then it kept rolling, and then we'd do the simple thing, which would be we'd take a comfort break, because we're tend to, it's funny how people tend to fall into that sort of thing. Is like when you don't treat some of these online stuff the same way as you would treat kind of offline, and that's one of the things we did, like on the fly, just learned it, but it was so well received because it normalized things. And then people would come back, and then we set them up with an activity where we said, right, fine, we will now want you to work as a group, and there might be 6 or 7 of them, and set it all up and said, here's the tools, sort of thing. We're now going to back away from this and come back in 30, 40 minutes and to hear kind of a debrief from you about kind of what you found out and what you want to do next, and so on and so forth. And it's gone down really, really well, because it is that bite-sized chunks. And it's kind of full of inclusivity and interactivity and all of those different sort of things, but it's tailored for that very specific and getting work done sort of, virtually.
Yes. And I think that's a brilliant model. And something I could definitely learn from. This kind of breaking down into segments and understanding. There's not much time to read a room when you've got 200 people online. Waiting. There's not much time to read a room. I could do that in a physical space, but often I've had to adapt the physical space, even changing tables and chairs around to adapt to the environment. There's not often much room to do that. So I think what I certainly could do more of is exactly as you've just demonstrated, just to have that kind of agile model in place that allows you to adapt and shape activities. I think that's brilliant.
Thank you. Well, I mean, it was purely done out of it. We thought we'd try it and experimented with it, and it worked the first time around. And now we've just completed, or are completing the third round, the second round, and thinking about the next one. So it's worked out really, really well. So by all means, kind of steal away. But I also kind of know that, rather than just, we've heard about the student and the sort of teacher experience, what you've done so far, and that's kind of been kind of brilliant. I mean, and you had foresight of it. Luckily, you had foresight of it based on, your student kind of demographic, and so you were able to get in front of it. But like you mentioned before, is like, I also know that you work with and have worked with a lot of sort of design-led and creative businesses, as well as art entrepreneurs. And the thing that really kind of like, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on is, because customer experience is this big thing, but it normally gets applied to products and services and so on and so forth. But what does customer experience kind of mean from a design-led creative business art entrepreneur kind of mean? What does it mean? Do they care?
So I'm going to give you my perspective, from my design's perspective, having worked for an agency many years ago, but what that meant for me as a freelancer with my own company. And I think the first thing for me was that experience or customer experience didn't have a full stop. I think there's a tendency, there was a tendency for me right at the beginning of my career to see customer service or customer experience as a service, excuse me. So I saw it as something that you just delivered, and it was, what you did as part of the process. But I see it more, and I saw this certainly as I was developing in well into my career, that this customer service was a continued dialogue and partnership with my clients. So, for example, if I just finished developing a brand and we had delivered what we called then the corporate kind of manual, if you want, and it was almost like a guideline to show how people should use this brand from its visual aesthetics. That was only part of the job. The real experience came in how I was able to continue that dialogue and to see and check in and to see this as a long-term relationship. So I think the first thing that the clients, especially the ones I worked with, that they really appreciated was that I was able to ensure that I was there for the long term. So many clients I worked with, God, we had, 10, 15-year relationships. It was really incredible. And I think the only thing that disrupted that was probably actually one of my more recent clients simply just moved to Europe, and they just found a client out there. Otherwise they'd still be working with me today. But so there wasn't much to disrupt that. But I always take a long-term approach to figuring out what that experience looks like. But when we break down experience, I also think about its value beyond that interaction. So much, I take great care and duty, especially in my own academic practice or my professional practice, thinking about how the experience is recommunicated. So
Okay.
having known you for a while and having read your book, Punk CX, I think it would be interesting to see how I'm recommunicating this book to people that I know. And that's
Right.
just valuable as how you communicated this book to me. I mean, you said, actually right at the beginning, I've written this book. What do you think of it? Great. That's level one. The next bit comes when you're thinking about actually how are people going to be talking about Adrian and his book, and how do you want to be perceived? So much of that experience, for me, that experience economy, if you want, or the
Hmm.
experience strategy, is thinking about how you want that experience to be recommunicated. So I took a lot of time in my design profession, um, really honing um, everything from reliability to maybe even cost to the finances to how quickly I was able to pick up the phone, delivery, all of those things, because I knew that had a value, because that's how
Mm.
those clients would be talking about me. If I'm
Mm.
really bad timekeeper amongst all of that, the first thing that was going to come up would be, actually, he's unreliable. Great work, but he's unreliable. And that
Sure.
is no good. So I think we have to think about the the recommunication of the experience.
Okay. I mean, I know that kind of we talked previously, and you shared with me a couple of examples around some of the things that some of the design-led, the creative businesses that you've kind of worked with, what they've done in terms of that to enhance their clients or their
Mm.
customers' experience. There was particularly one that you told me, a story you told me around a sculptor,
Mm.
and it be interested for you to kind of maybe tell me that story. Maybe if you another one, if you have one, because I think what it shows, what I wanted and why I wanted you to tell that story is the what an art entrepreneur, what an artist has done to improve engagement and their overall experience. Because I just think it's a beautiful example.
So and it's interesting now because we're seeing more and more of this, and certainly people who are demonstrating their process, demonstrating their artistry, because this is something that starts to differentiate them. So I'll give you
Right.
a couple, so I'll give you an example of the sculpture, and I've also got another example here of kind of really simple, but a person who was a baker,
Okay.
someone who made bread. Um, so we're working with artists who find themselves in a saturated space. Now, what I've done over the certainly the last couple of years is try and help them define exactly what it is that makes them different, their
Mm-hmm.
differentiation, but also keeping tethered, staying tethered to their craft and to their creativity.
Right.
Now, one thing I've tried to demonstrate or maybe help them amplify is by giving people some way in to their process, and not just showing the final object as this kind of finished piece of art,
Mm-hmm.
but somehow giving a way in to identify exactly what things inspired them, what were some of their references, um, uh, some insight into the knowledge of the
Mm-hmm.
materials they're using, and how do you give that some kind of an embodiment that you're able to present that to the world that becomes a piece of art in itself. Now,
Right.
now the individuals I've worked with have found that has uh, enhanced their communication. It's helped them to develop their business model purely because they have been able to separate themselves from their competitors by giving insight into the iterative process. And that's really important, that they don't just see this final object, but how they got there in those various steps, to see it as an accumulation, a cumulative process.
So it's a bit like they've moved from being it's a piece of art and maybe a product, as it were, to being actually you've extended that, and it's sort of so the client ends up feeling that they have one increased engagement, but also like a relationship, almost a direct relationship with the artist, because they're taken on a journey, as it were.
Precisely. And this was really valuable with the artists that I worked with. I said, you want to try and take people through the process, take them on a journey, and show them what it was like, from the beginning, and what inspired that art, and also reveal some of the errors, if you want, or how failure played a part in that process as well, because that can be quite revealing.
Right.
And to show that there is a human element to your work as well. So I think there's value in showing. Yeah, certainly. I've got a fascination with art, seeing unfinished art, for example.
Right.
And to see how all right, you might see the finished piece, but I'd like to see the kind of those various steps, and how, perhaps if you're seeing a portrait, what did they start with? Was it the eyes, the nose, the mouth? But
right.
how that emerged. And I think that's just as important, if you're able to share that. And I think we're now, YouTube and Instagram have been brilliant platforms for, where artists have been able to demonstrate and show part of that process as well. So much more interested in showing the final piece. And there's a good friend of mine, Natalie Nahai. She's in Barcelona now, Barcelona School of Art, I think it is, College of Art. And she's been absolutely prolific last couple of years, showing all her work and a lot of her portraits. But what's been just as revealing and just as rewarding is seeing the early sketches,
right,
and how these pieces of art develops over time. And actually, I've taken more from seeing those early pieces than the final product, the final pieces. But yeah. Awesome. The other example, if I may, just very quickly.
Of course.
Okay, so yeah, really good example is the Bread Ahead School, which was founded by Matthew Jones. I think this is a really, really good example of where a traditional baking craft has moved into an area of knowledge transfer, and they've developed their own courses, and they've gone into e-learning. And I think this is a really good example of an organization that has adapted with the times, taken their craft and not only just creating traditional schools or classes or workshops, but moving the whole thing online. So I believe they've got actually a YouTube presence as well, but developing real kind of collateral out of their knowledge.
Yeah.
And this is where we see another example of process playing a vital part in the experience economy. If we got Bread Ahead or another baker side by side, how do they differentiate? And this is a brilliant example of how they've been able to stand out from the crowd by developing real collateral out of their knowledge.
Nice. So the thing that you alluded to it earlier on, and you mentioned it about learning as well. I shared with you an article that I wrote back in in July, and it was a reflection on, well, I birthed the article, I like to say, because it turned into a bit of an essay rather than a small post, and it was a reflection on what I saw was like 4 of these imperatives that were emerging out of the impact of the pandemic. And those imperatives were, learning and resilience, protection, and sort of experience. And it was just a thought piece, kind of like, this is me thinking out loud, as it were. And what I've been also doing since then is sort of just kind of asking some people for their reflections and whether they're seeing the same things, and if any of the ones that I identified, if they kind of like stood out or resonated with them.
Well, I really enjoyed the piece. It was a really well written piece. I was drawn to, as I would be, because I'm an academic, the learning
Uh-huh.
section, and purely because I've seen. I really like the idea. Actually, it's funny. There's a play of words here because I really like the idea that you've got a full stop behind Adrian Swinscoe on your website, and that red dot is very powerful. It's very interesting. If you put a dot behind learning, it
Yeah.
becomes a very, very different thing. And I think I'm restless with the idea that learning would ever have a full stop, even if it's the end of the sentence. I think they should make it a law that learning should never have a full stop, irrespective of where it is in the sentence. And purely because I see it as, and maybe it's a bit cliche, but I see learning as ongoing, it's lifelong. And so I think I'm in this space where I see learning with many conditions, on the condition that you see it as exploratory, it's
Mm-hmm.
not absolute, and that also there is a collaborative, collective element to learning.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I learn much by being in a room by myself. Yes, you could stick me in a room with lots of books, and my office here has got lots of books, and I can learn. But it means nothing if I can't share that knowledge or debate that knowledge or even come out of that and have my own opinion. So it's really important that learning isn't seen as a kind of a solitary pursuit, that it's seen as much more of a collective thing. So um, and and I think there are elements of that in your piece. If I was to look at any one of those elements and think, actually, what is the future for that,
Mm-hmm.
I would probably add a word in front of that, and which is maybe um, future learning, or we're always thinking about uh, agile learning. So how do you adapt to different environments? And so, we might say that actually the last 6 months have changed the whole ideology of what learning is, and
Mm.
it was certainly about adapting. I know individuals that were total technophobes, but have suddenly embraced this digital technology. They've even bought new phones and got rid
Mm.
of their brick phones. If you get what I'm talking about.
Yeah, sure.
So I think there's learning that is, the want to learn, but there's also another element that is the need to learn, because you're having to adapt to new environments as well.
Awesome. And so, Richie, I mean, I was thinking about kind of like all of this, and is there any kind of reflections that based on kind of what we talked about, and also your own experience for the last kind of like kind of few months that you know that you'd like to kind of like address or kind of like to share with us kind of before that I just missed out, as it were? Anything else that you'd like to
Mm.
add that we've missed out? Because I I think that that's one of the reasons I invite you on the podcast. Is just it's a different flavor, so you're not in the experience per se sort of space, but you deal with it on a daily basis, if you know what I mean.
Well, I think so. I navigate this spectrum of being proactive
Mm-hmm.
and being reactive.
Right.
And for me, whether it's in education or in branding, I've always had to navigate those spaces. Way early in my branding experience, it was very proactive. So somebody would come to you because they needed something, and then you reacted to it. So you had to react to what their needs were.
Yeah.
And that was okay. It wasn't as rewarding though, because I was fulfilling their needs. I had a lot more fun when I approached people because I was able to identify something that they hadn't quite encountered.
Yes.
So I was being proactive because I was going to individuals and organizations and saying, "Oh, have you realized?" And this was way before the internet. Realizing that they could do different things with their marketing, and then when we were looking at branding, how they would start to move that onto online spaces such as the early HTML websites. But I was
Mm.
trying to be ahead of that curve before they realized it. So many people I spoke with, I was really at that kind of proactive space, and trying to give them something that they hadn't even encountered. And Adrian, there was a lot of resistance because they couldn't see it, and my job and my craft was getting them to kind of come into my vision.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's still the case too. It's like, you know, some people don't like that because they find it quite challenging, because they feel like they lose control over things, I guess.
Yes, and I think there's something to be said for how you communicate that. You know, I've always done it in a way that it's never been. I've never wanted it to look like a hard sell, but really be invested in showing them the opportunity or getting them to endorse your vision. And that's really important, and that happens in education as well. So I think it's really important to be proactive, but also to respond, to be reactive, to respond to needs. Right now, we're seeing individuals now responding to social injustice. We're seeing individuals responding to climate change. We're seeing people respond to, for example, gender equality, and this is brilliant. And I know many artists who are choosing their time. They're saying, right, you know, as an artist, people are calling on me, people are waiting for me to respond to this. I'm not ready yet, but when they do, they know that their response is valuable.
Right.
So that's the good side of being responsive and being reactive to a condition. But the other side is, you know, those pioneers who are meeting unmet needs. So for me, I think to figure out what we've missed, I think individuals, organizations, brands, artists, people who are in the customer experience space, decide and understand where you are on that spectrum. It might be that you're navigating, as I've done throughout my career, that you are navigating both proactive and reactive, but decide and be decisive about where you stand with a client. And what vision you're giving them. So I think it's having a better understanding of that spectrum.
Nice. I think you just answered my next question, because I was about to ask you about what would be your best advice to somebody wanting to deliver a better experience, and it sounds like you've just kind of answered the question by saying, understand where you are on the spectrum and decide and be decisive.
Yes, yeah. I used to be decisive, but I'm not so sure now.
He says, kind of the cabaret drums going.
Yeah.
So I tell you what, Richie, you know, let's switch it up a little bit. And I want you to, you know, you talked about learning and you talked about future learning and stuff. I mean, if I was to switch gears a little bit and wanted to ask you to look forward and think, well, what is the future of service and sort of experience, you know, maybe in your own context, maybe from a student sort of experience, a learning experience perspective? I mean, what does the future look like? What do you think some of the key challenges are that we're going to need to navigate?
Okay, well, the minute you say future, I think digital.
Right.
I think it's about giving clients, customers, I'm hesitant to use the word users, but to give them an experience that is seamless. It's got to be trouble-free. And whether it's devices or whether it's systems or software, that's got to be seamless. It's got to be hassle-free. And as I've mentioned earlier on, it's got to be something where you are transferring or communicating how easy that experience was. So ease of use, but how you communicate that to others. I think the future is also going to be less about social media, but more about connective media. So the clients the people who are offering the customer experience are going to need to be part of that conversation. Social media is allowing the customers to speak to each other. If I'm not happy with something, I'm going to tell you, and you're going to tell someone else, and the brand is left outside of that picture.
Right.
But if they're connected to us and really figure out, oh, Adrian, I see that you're unhappy with this. Let me give you a £5 voucher because I understand that you were unhappy, for example. That's a really crude example, but we need to think about how brands and people who are offering services can be a lot more connected. I'm not talking about brand loyalty, but really about understanding what connecting with your customers really is. So that's going to be the future, understanding and even creating a science out of it, really figuring out what the behavior change is to gain trust and to maintain trust as well.
Right. Perfect. Rich, thank you for that. I mean, so I've got one final question, or well, actually a couple of questions that I wanted to ask. Now, as you know, published Punk CX last year, and also want to give you, big hat tip to you because I shared an early draft with you, and you gave me some phenomenal sort of feedback on the early draft. So, first of all, yeah, thank you. And so, but what I've been doing since then is I've been asking people on the podcast, I've been doing like this social research, as it were. I've been asking them two things, and they're a bit like sort of word association questions. And the first one is, what one or two words would you use to describe a more punk approach to experience?
One word.
One or two words.
Okay. Creatively disruptive.
Creatively disruptive. Love it. And what company or brand do you think epitomizes that sort of ethos?
So I think there's an individual that comes to mind immediately. And this is someone who's been someone who I've referenced in some of my lectures, but I also use as an example when I'm speaking with clients on the design side. Sorry, can I just go back and say, I just want to go back, right? Everyone should read Punk CX because it really is quite brilliant. Sorry, we're not going to skip over that because I think can I just segue for a bit?
Yeah, of course, you do whatever you want, Richie. It's fine.
No, because
I'm totally keeping this in. This is not getting edited out.
Well, I mean, what I find interesting about this, I read this from cover to cover, and literally, page 148 right up to the last page, and I read that in a linear fashion. But I come to this every now and then to just serendipitously flick through a page and be reminded of some of the kind of, as I put here, the creative disruption. And you can come at this book literally at any page and just be reminded of the importance of thinking differently, but how you can also use this the Punk CX methodology in your own practice. So I'm just flicking to one page, and there was one page. I think I've lost it now. Not all friction is bad. I mean, brilliant. And you can use that in any context you want, but I use that as a conversation starter in some of my lectures. I do credit to you, Adrian.
Oh,
well.
Thank you. I tell you what, Richie, the check is in the post, my friend. The check is in the post.
But also, again, a few pages before that, do you dare to be different? What I really like about this is this particular page. It doesn't prescribe. It's not saying, okay, how to be different or you should dare to be different, but the provocations and how it's phrased through questions and almost prodding you. So I think there's a conversation going on here where you look at it and you feel like, actually, even after reading one page, you come out exhausted because you think, oh, okay, this is what I really should be thinking. And it's not being prescriptive, but it's provocative enough to get you thinking. And if in the right hands, you can open this up to lots of different areas in your space. I've still got to learn how to use this in my creative practice. It's being used brilliantly in my education, in my educative practice, and I think it's definitely a brilliant resource. I wouldn't even call it a tool. I would call it something you just got to keep referring to.
Richie, thanks.
Well, just anyway, yeah. So that's all I'd say about that. So I don't want to skip over that because I think that was really worth kind of going over in a bit more detail.
No, you're welcome. Thank you so much for that. But so you were going to tell me about this a person?
Yes. So a few years ago now, I'm sure it was about 10 years ago. Some of you might be familiar with Box Park. The first one was founded in
Is it Shoreditch or was it in Croydon? Which was the first
Shoreditch, one? Yeah. So Croydon came a bit later.
Right.
And founded by Roger Wade. I've had the honor to meet him a couple of times. Brilliant individual, brilliant creative mind. But he had this vision, and he may have. I think you'd have to look at some of uh, his documentaries or his films, his footage to really understand exactly what his ideology was. But what I pick out from this was that he was he dared to be different by reimagining what retail, food, and entertainment, what those spaces would look like. But rather than just get a big traditional space, he reimagined what that environment would look like, and he disrupted the environment by simply getting these big metal steel containers, the shipping containers, and that became part of the brand. And what I loved about what Box Parker did is that they, going into the environment, it was very clear that there was a strong identity that was being used because of these used or repurposed containers. But what I found even more compelling is that going into that space, there was something pioneering about it, because while he was fusing this environment of food, retail, and entertainment and fashion. So I think I forgot to say, it wasn't just kind of retail in general, it was also fashion. Felt you were in a space that was so transient that no two visits would ever be the same. That there were spaces that were temporary. You had guests, you had pop-up spaces. So every environment, every visit was unique, and I think that was quite pioneering in itself. And it wasn't just like going into a mall where you would see the kind of the same outfits. What he also created was, even though we had established brands there, what they created was a kind of a scarcity. So there were certain brands, certain lines that would only be seen in Box Park, for example. So I think that was brilliant in reshaping what this space would look like. So that for me stands out as one of the things that really challenge the kind of experience, what experience looks like. And I'm going back to something I mentioned earlier on, that for him, experience didn't have a full stop. It was this constant thing. It was emergent. It was morphing, because every single time that experience would be different.
Yeah. Awesome.
So yeah, that's one example I wanted to bring up.
Perfect. I mean, I love that example. I mean, I think I'm a bit, in inverted commas, I've experienced kind of Box Park, and I love what they've done, how they've folded all sorts of different things together. So it's a great example.
Yeah.
But Richie, I just wanted to say that's been brilliant. Thank you for that. As I say, congratulations on the work that you do, and also the recent kind of promotion. I think it's kind of well deserved. Thank you for the kind words you said about the book. I mean, that's like, I'm sitting here blushing. But I finally just want to say thank you for sharing your time and your experience and your insight with us today. That's been awesome.
A real pleasure, and thank you very much for having me on the podcast series. Look forward to hearing it back.
Well, that was cool. I hope you enjoyed it. I did, and I always do, actually, because I always learn something new when I speak to some of these amazing kind of people. And it's always something new that I can incorporate into my writing, speaking, workshops, and other sort of advisory work that I do. Now, if you're interested in learning about any of that sort of stuff, then you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswinscoe.com. One final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or Spotify or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as they say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do tune in again soon. All the very best. Cheers. Bye.